everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. I hope that you will like what you see and subscribe below for more. In today's video, we're going to be sewing. Yay! We're going to be following along to Mccalls 7810. This is a Mrs. Tops pattern, and I'm going to be following along with View B on this pattern. If you have any questions about the fabrics that I purchased, the notions that I purchased, the sewing supplies that I'll be using, and the size that I cut, then definitely check out this preview video. I went over all of those details as well as went through the pattern instructions to make sure there was nothing in there that will trip us up while we're sewing the top. Before we start sewing, I do want to mention a couple things. The first thing being that I sewed my top, and I have it right here. I sewed my top completely different from the pattern instructions. The instructions, they have you to sew the fabric and lining as one. So your zipper tape is showing in the garment, the waist seam, all of those things are showing in the garment. Now that's not a problem. If you want to sew your top that way, then by all means just follow the instructions. But for me, I wanted my lining to actually cover, hide, and conceal all of those seams and my zipper tape. So I sewed those pieces separately as opposed to sewing them together how the instructions have you do it. And I really like the way the top came together. I think it's just a little bit cleaner on the inside. I can give you a quick close-up of it before we start sewing it. So you can see here that the zipper tape, everything is inside the lining and is not exposed, and the waist seam is also I slip stitched the lining around that, so all of those seams are covered as opposed to, you know, sewing the fabrics as one and seeing those seams. But again, the choice is yours. You stitch your top however you are comfortable with sewing it, but I just want to let you know that I went a little bit away from the instructions with this one in this video. Now we can start sewing. So to begin working on our top, we are going to stitch our front bodice pieces together right here along the center front seam. You see here that I transferred a marking, so I'm going to begin sewing right here at the bottom. I'm going to stitch up to the circle and back stitch there. So let's go ahead and stitch our front bodice together now. Once you have the center front seam sewn, we can go ahead and give that a press. Now, because this top is lined, I will not finish it off with my serger, so I can just go ahead and leave the edges unfinished, but just press them. Once you have it pressed, let's move on to the next step. Next, we're going to put our front bodice to the side and start working on our ties. So you should have cut out 2 ties. And with right sides facing, I'm going to fold my ties. So we're gonna leave this end open, and then we're gonna stitch all the way down this long edge here, as well as this diagonal side at a 5/8 of inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and fold our other tie in half the same way. And now we can take both of them to the machine and again stitch at a 5/8 of an inch along this long edge in the diagonal side, but leave this short opening edge here open. Now that I have both of the ties sewn, I'm going to go ahead and give them a trim. Once you have them trimmed, we can go ahead and flip them right side out. Go ahead and wiggle out your corners. If you need to, you can grab a pin and use the pin to kind of poke that corner out, pull that corner out. So I'm going to try to wiggle this out with the pin here. Okay, once you have the corners out, go ahead and turn the other one right side out and give it a good press. Now that I have the ties pressed, I'm going to take it to the machine now, and I'm going to baste this raw edge open, and I'm also going to put 2 rows of gathering stitches on this opening edge. So first let's baste it closed, and then let's go ahead and put 2 rows of gathering stitches right here on both of these opening edges now. Now that we have the raw edges basted and gathered, we can grab our front piece, and with right sides facing up, you should have transferred 2 circles right here along both side edges of the bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my gathers so that they can fit. The markings will match on the ties as well as the bodice. So let's go ahead and pull up our gathering stitches. Now that you have both of the ties pinned in place, we can go ahead and baste them onto the bodice. Alright, so now that we have the ties basted on, our next step is to go ahead and grab our back pieces. So I have my 2 back pieces here. With right sides facing, we're going to go ahead and lay our back to our fronts. And we're going to pin up here along the shoulder and overarm seam. And we're also going to pin the underarm and side seam. And do that for both of your back pieces. So let's go ahead and grab our pins and start pinning in place now. Go ahead and pin the other overarm and shoulder seam and the underarm and side seam the same way. Once you have both sides pinned, we can go ahead and stitch them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance now. Now that we have the overarm seam, the shoulder seam, and underarm and side seam sewn, I'm going to do just a little bit of trimming, and I'm also going to clip right here into the curve right up under this underarm seam. And once I have it trimmed down, I'm going to give it a press. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same trimming to the other side, and then we can move on to the next step. So now that I have my seams, they are pressed flat, and for this curve I did use my hem right here to help me press to keep the curve intact. So now that I have that done, we can go ahead and press up our sleeve hem allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and press up the hem 5/8 of an inch and just go ahead and give that a press. Okay, now we can go ahead and sit this to the side and begin working on our lining. So here are my 2 lining pieces, and I'm going to do the same exact thing that I did to the fabric pieces. So first I'm going to stitch the center front seam together, making sure that I stop right here at the circle that I transferred. And then I will put these pieces right sides facing. I'm going to stitch the overarm seam and shoulder seam, as well as this underarm and side seam together. And then I will also trim, press, and fold up the seam allowance for the hem of the sleeve. So I'm going to do all those steps again. The only thing we're not doing is attaching a tie. So let's go ahead and do those steps, and then we'll meet back up here once those are all done, and then we'll start working on attaching it to the bodice. Alright, so I have my lining done. You can see here I've stitched along this overarm and shoulder seam as well as this underarm seam. I've turned up the 5/8 of an inch along the sleeve hem. I've also stitched my center front together. So right here you can see that I have transferred my pleat lines right here at the bottom. I did it for the lining as well as for my fashion fabric. You can see here I have my lines transferred. It's probably hard to see, but I have it. See my markings right there. So because I want to do my pieces separately as opposed to how the instructions do it, I am going to go ahead and baste along all of these pleat lines right now, and I'm going to go ahead and create my pleats. So now that we have basted along the pleat lines of our lining as well as our bodice piece, now we're going to go ahead and create the pleats. So I have my pins right here. And all of the pleats, they start out and come in toward the center. So with this line right here for this first pleat, I'm going to bring it toward the center front. It's going to meet up with this pleat line in front of it to create that pleat. So I'm going to grab that pleat line and bring it to that pleat, and I'm going to pin that in place. I'm going to take this next pleat line and bring it to the next one in front of that, again going toward the center front. And then I'm going to pin that in place as well. And then for the last pleat here, I'm going to bring it to the next one the same way. And pin that in place. I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. I'm going to start with this outer one here and bring it to the next pleat line. Pin that in place. I'm just going to continue taking one pleat leg to the next. I'm going to go ahead and create the pleats the same way for the lining. And again, I'm working on the right side of the fabric. So this is the right side and this is the right side as well. So I'm going to just bring the basted lines to the pleat lines together the same exact way. All right, once you have your pleats formed on your lining as well as your fabric, we can go ahead and baste along the pleats and also baste along this lower edge of them as well. So let's go ahead and do all the basting now. All right, so I have my pleats all basted. Here is my fashion fabric and the front pleats right here. They are basted and pressed down. I also did the same thing for my lining. My lining pieces, I did go back and I pinned the pleats along the inside on the wrong side instead of the right side like I did the bodice, because I want, when this is all together, I want it to be clean on the inside facing me. So this is what the right side of the lining will look like, the part that would be touching me. And then once we have this attached, I can remove all of these basting stitches here. So this is what the inside of my lining will look like. I also went ahead and pressed up the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance right here for my lining only. I did not do that for the fashion fabric because we're going to attach the peplum to this, but I did press up 5/8 of an inch for the lining. So now the next step is to go ahead and start working on our peplum. So here are my two peplum pieces here. This right here is piece 5 and this is 6. So working with 5 first, I'm going to go ahead and pin the center seam of that together. And now I can go to the machine and stitch this down now. So I have my front peplum stitched right here down the center seam, and I also finished off the edge. I just finished them off together and pressed it to one side. You can finish them off separately and press your seam flat. That choice is yours. So now that we have the center front seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and with right sides facing, pin on the back peplums to the side, matching up the notches, and pin in place. Once you have it pinned, go ahead to the sewing machine and stitch them down at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have the back pieces of your peplum sewn to the front, we can go ahead and do one row of ease stitching along the back peplum pieces only. So I'm going to go to the machine now and go ahead and do the ease stitching for the back peplum pieces. Now that we have the peplum ease stitched along the back peplum pieces, now we can go ahead and pin it right sides facing to our bodice. So I'm gonna put my bodice right sides facing up. I'm just gonna flip up my bodice, grab my pins, and pin in place. I'm going to pull up this ease stitch on the back to ease in the back peplum to get it to fit, and pin it in place. Once we have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch it in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then stitch it again at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so now that I have my peplum attached to my bodice, I finished off my seam allowance, but again, it's not necessary because I will be lining it, and my lining will cover up the seam allowance here. But if you did your lining the way that the pattern calls for, then definitely go ahead and finish off your seam allowance. So from here, the next step is to go ahead and install our zipper. And you can see I finished off the bottom edge with my serge of this peplum because this portion will show regardless if you do the lining the way I'm doing it or the way that the pattern has it, this part of the peplum will be showing. So I have my zipper here and I have the zipper pull facing down. I'm going to make sure that my zipper stop, the zipper itself, not this tape up here. The zipper itself is 5/8 of an inch down from this neck edge because we still have to sew on our lining. So I want to make sure that the zipper stop is not in the way. So once I have it there where I need it, I'm going to go ahead and pin the zipper in place. And you want to make sure you are pinning your zipper along the 5/8 of an inch seam line. So the zipper tape won't line up with the edge of the fabric. It's going to be along that 5/8 of an inch seam line, and you can adjust that once you get over to your machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin this portion of the zipper down. Okay, once you have this side of the zipper pinned in place, we can go ahead and stitch it. And I'm going to stitch right here. I'm going to kind of push my zipper coils over so that I can stitch in the groove of that zipper. So let's go ahead and stitch this side down now. Okay, so now that I have this side sewn on, I'm going to go ahead and zip my zipper closed. And right here where we have this seam where the bodice connects to the peplum, this waist seam, I'm going to go ahead and put a mark right here. I'm going to put it on both sides of the zipper. So now I can pin this side of the zipper to this side of the bodice. I'm going to pin that in place right at that marking, right at that seam. Now I can unzip the zipper. I'm going to go ahead and pin this side to the zipper tape, and then I can take it to the machine and stitch it down, and because I put this marking here, it will meet up with this other seam once I'm done stitching it. So now I'm going to go to the machine and stitch this in place. Okay, so now I have my zipper installed. I'm going to go ahead and zip it up to see if those seams match. And there you go. It's a perfect meet up right here. And all I did was just close up my zipper and transfer that marking. Now, my ginghams do not match, but at least that waist seam does, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and zip this up, close that up. So now let's go ahead and finish up the center back seam with the top. I'm going to go ahead and pin this together. And now you want to go ahead and stitch the remainder of the center seam closed. While I'm here at the machine, I'm also going to go ahead and stitch down the size of the zipper tape to the seam allowance only. Again, seam allowance only. Alright, so here is the right side of my top is facing up. I'm going to go ahead and grab my lining here. Right side's facing. I'm going to go ahead and pin along this neck edge, and I'm also going to pin down my zipper edge. I'm going to pin down that as well. So let's go ahead and do all of our pinning. I want to make sure that the seam allowance I pressed up on the lining, that it stays folded up. I'm going to pin that in place. I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side the same way. Alright, so once you have your lining pinned along the zipper tape as well as the front neck edge, we can go ahead and take it to the machine now and stitch it in place. Okay, so now that I have the lining sewn, I'm going to flip this to the inside first just to see how everything looks. So first we have a nice clean finish right here around our zipper. So now the inside of our top will look like this. I will pull out all of these basin stitches once I have it stitched down. But now the lining will cover this waist seam that we have here, and you have a really nice clean finish. So this is why I decided to do the top this way, just so it could be a little bit cleaner. I know that the peplum seams are still, you know, showing, but that's okay. I just like this method a little bit better. I think it gives us a little bit more, you know, cleanness to the garment. So now I'm going to go back and trim off my seam allowances, and then we will move on to the next step. So now that I have everything turned to the right side, I want to go ahead and do understitching along this neck edge. And understitching is done to prevent the lining from rolling out as you're wearing your garment. So let's go ahead and do some understitching now. And understitching is done with just stitching the seam allowance to the lining only. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so I have done the understitching along the neckline of my top. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish off my sleeve hem, but I'll be honest, I really do not want to slip stitch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold in. We already pressed up the hem allowances on our lining as well as on our top. So I'm just going to put that together like so. I'm going to hold it right here. I'm going to reach between the lining and the fabric. I'm going to come up here and grab this fabric here that I pinched. Make sure you hold it, and I'm going to pull it to the inside, making sure everything is even and smooth. And I'm just going to pin it in place. When you get to the next seam, you want to line that up the same way and pin that in place. So now we have just pinned our lining and sleeve hems together. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Make sure that I fold in the hem allowance that we already pressed up for the sleeve and for the fabric. I'm going to hold it together here. I'm going to reach under the lining. Pull that to the inside, smooth everything out, line up my seams, and pin in place the same way all the way around. Okay, so I have both sleeves pinned. Now I'm going to go ahead and stitch them in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here we are. This is what our sleeve looks like now, and all we need to do is just give it a good press. So now we can go ahead and I'm gonna go back into the seam and trim it and go ahead and stitch the other one the same way. Alright, so from here, now that I have the sleeves finished and I've pressed them flat, now I can turn this to the wrong side out. So it looks like this. And now I'm gonna go ahead and pin my lining over my waist seam because I'm going to slip stitch this closed. Alright, so now that I have the lining pinned, I'm going to go ahead and grab a needle and thread and slip stitch it closed now, and I'll be back to show you what it looks like once I'm done. Alright, so I just finished slip stitching the lining onto the bodice along that waist seam. So here's a close-up of how that looks. So the last step is to go ahead and fold up a narrow hem and hem your peplum. As you can see, I have this embroidered edge, so I'm not going to hem that. But for your peplum, go ahead and turn up a 5/8 of an inch narrow hem, stitch it in place, and you're all done with your top. Thank you so much for joining me for another Sew With Me video. I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave them for me down below. I'll be more than happy to answer. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next video. I'll see you all then. Blessings, everyone. Bye.